It was not responding, despite the almost daily protests and demonstrations and so on by the large Tamil community here. And we felt that was really quite that was really quite shocking that a government was not responding to demand from its own citizens, and we felt that more attention should be brought to the government. And one of the ways we thought we could do this was as non-Tamils, by trying to bring an impartial voice to the struggle, to say that there is really something happening there that has to be taken seriously, and that we as non-Tamils support the struggles of people who are gathering in freezing cold temperatures in Toronto and Ottawa and elsewhere to make their protest and their desperation felt so strongly. So one of the first things we did at that point was and before I go on, I just want to say one of the things that particularly drew us as academics and why we decided to get together as a group of teachers and researchers was because so many of our students, especially in the Toronto region, were involved on a daily basis in these struggles. And we were getting emails, we were getting requests to talk, and so many of our students were having difficulties keeping up with their assignments, doing their exams, and we knew that this was something that was really an emotional crisis for many of our students. And so that was partly what actually brought us to this. So, you know, we came out of this kind of personal relationship to many of our students as well, and recognizing what they were going through. So one of the first things we did was, and we haven't done a lot so far, so mainly what I wanted to say here today is just express our solidarity and the fact that we exist, talk a little bit about the 2 statements that we have put out and what our future plans are, and then see at the end of the day at the discussion what ideas you might have for a group like us and what we can actually be doing. So the first thing that we did is we put together a statement calling on the Government of Canada to do, yes please. We put forward this statement, and essentially this was put together at the end of April. It was distributed across Canadian universities, and we called on the Government of Canada to essentially at that time call for a ceasefire, an immediate comprehensive ceasefire, and urge the international community to take responsibility for what was going on in northern Sri Lanka. So this was, of course, you know, you can see the demands. I'm not going to read them out. They're now, many of them, obviously not any longer applicable. So that was the statement. We circulated it. We got over 125 signatures in about 3 days. So in 3 days, we had academics from coast to coast in Canada signing on, as well as some non-academics, some ministers. We had signatures from, of course, Jack Layton, but also from the Bloc Québécois leaders from Quebec, as well as Bill Graham, who was former Foreign Affairs Minister, External Affairs Minister, as well as several academics who work on Sri Lanka who are based in the United States or in Europe. So we got a very, very distinguished list of signatories that we then released to the media. Of course, you know, with only, as you know, a limited kind of impact in terms of what the Canadian government actually did based on statements such as this. Then at the end of May, after the conflict was officially declared over, we put forward another urgent statement. This time we did not ask for signatures. We just wanted to issue the statement right away, and this time it was much more trying to see what needed to be done right away. And again, here our concern was humanitarian efforts to bring relief to the people who had been affected most, wounded, displaced, interned in the camps. And also, of course, to deal with the very serious issues of war crimes that had been carried out in this period. So how could the international community deal with these kinds of issues? But furthermore, we were concerned about possible prosecutions for people such as the 3 doctors who had been reporting on the extent of casualties and who were then at that time then, you know, very uncertain what kinds of, what they would face, and then of course were arrested and are now still being held. So those were our concerns at that time, and of course our concerns were for ongoing mechanisms to try and resolve the conflict in a political way. But throughout So one of the things that we've been concerned about in both the statements, and as has been expressed already, is the fact that in the absence of any kind of independent and international monitoring, we really don't have a sense of the scale. So you hear apologists, you hear, of course, the government of Sri Lanka making its own kinds of statements about how there's been hardly any deaths, how things are so wonderful in the camps, and then you hear various other kinds of accounts of how bad things are, but really we have very few independent kinds of information, and we need much more of that. So there seems to be very little credibility if indeed there is nothing, if the camps are actually in such good shape, in fact there are no crimes being committed, then why is the government so afraid of having international monitors and international media in there? So this is one of the things that we feel that we should be pressing for much more. So having said that, we put out these two statements, and now we're in the process of trying to think about where we should go next and how we can get some of those 125 signatories to become more active members of the group, and what kinds of activities we can undertake. So essentially, it seems that we have identified so far, but very provisionally, certain kinds of priorities for ourselves as a group and what we will be focusing on. The first, it seems to us, is the focus on human rights in the camps and in the areas under military occupation. So all the things that were mentioned, such as access to food and drinking water, the right to mobility and health care. One of the claims, the fact that people are being held, that even people who have families and homes are not being allowed to go back to them, there seems to be no justification for this. The claim is that there's screening being undertaken, there's security concerns, that people are members of the LTTE, they were combatants, they have to be screened. But it seems that then essentially the argument is that all people of that region, all the Tamils of those districts can be held indefinitely simply because of these security concerns. So essentially what you're doing is you're holding innocent civilians indefinitely, and that's a real human rights concern that we think we need to press for. And the process then, if indeed screening is required, that screening needs to be carried out by some kind of independent monitoring mechanism like a UN body, as opposed to simply being carried out in the absence of these, because how do we know really what that process is? And of course, we have all the evidence that people are disappearing, that they're taken to separate camps from which we don't hear any details about who's being arrested and who is not. The second focus we would like to have is on resettlement and development. It seems that unless there's an emphasis on disbanding the camps, right now there's no time frame being given for how long these people are going to be held in internment camps. There's already moves, and in fact you see the kinds of requests for assistance and aid that are coming out, not just from the Sri Lankan government, but from NGOs affiliated or who are working there, asking for aid to improve the conditions in the camp and to build them into more permanent structures. And that's a concern, because what does it mean to create sort of permanent welfare villages when you have people with homes, with farms, with fishing equipment, or they should be allowed to go back so that you can have a functioning, settled population that can begin to rebuild its own life. And that again is something that we think there has to be real pressure given, real pressure put to ensure that kind of return as far as possible to normalcy, especially beginning with people who have homes and families, extended families to return to. And one of the key things for this is, of course, demilitarization. And unfortunately, it seems that the situation is, in fact, quite the opposite, quite the contrary. If you want normalcy to return, you would need to reduce the military presence. In fact, what we're seeing, and the reports are that the government has just decided to increase its military recruitment and spending on the military, and it's going to up the size of the military by one half. So you're going to have a whole 100,000 more soldiers being recruited for counterinsurgency or for being placed in the north in order to ensure that armed movements cannot renew